Lynn Bush left for the grocery store on a Tuesday morning in 1990 and never came back. Within days, not weeks, not months, her husband David had already moved another woman into their home. No searching, no grief, no waiting. Just a new girlfriend settling into the space where his wife had been living, as if the vacancy had been planned well in advance. That single fact should have ended David Bush's freedom in 1990. It didn't. And the 17 years that followed, the cold case, the life insurance scheme, the truck he sold hoping evidence would disappear with it, and the daughter who grew up carrying an image she couldn't shake, is a story about what happens when the system looks at a missing woman and decides, too quickly, that she probably just left. Lynn was in her 30s, living in Casper, Wyoming with her husband David and their 4-year-old daughter Misty. Casper sits at the center of Wyoming, the state's second-largest city, built on oil money and flanked by high plains that roll outward in every direction toward mountains most longtime residents stopped bothering to name anymore, because they've always just been there. It is the kind of city where people build lives quietly, where a marriage can deteriorate behind closed doors for years before anyone outside the house fully understands what has been happening inside it. Lynn's marriage had been deteriorating for a long time. Not loudly, not with public confrontations or police calls that left a paper trail, but in the quiet way that dangerous marriages erode. In the things she said carefully to people she trusted, in the specific wariness she carried that the people close to her recognized even when they couldn't name it precisely. She had been confiding in friends. She was worried. She was thinking about leaving. She had a daughter she loved and a life she was trying to figure out how to rebuild on her own terms, away from a man whose behavior had made her careful in ways a woman shouldn't have to be careful in her own home. She went to the grocery store on a Tuesday morning. She never arrived. David reported her missing to Casper police. He told investigators he had woken up that morning, found her gone, and assumed she had gone out to run errands. He described her as someone who might leave without saying much. He was cooperative. He answered questions. He presented himself as a worried husband doing what worried husbands do. What investigators found first was Lynn's car. Her 1980 Chevrolet Citation was located in the parking lot of the Buttrey Food and Drug Store in Casper, the exact grocery store she had told people she was heading to that morning. The car was there. Lynn was not. The doors were unlocked. And sitting inside the vehicle, exactly where she would have left it if she had simply stepped out for a moment, was her purse. Her identification. Her money. Everything a woman needs to exist in the world, abandoned in a parking lot on a Tuesday morning. Casper Police Department officers processed the scene carefully. The car showed no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no damage, nothing that announced itself as obvious evidence of a violent encounter in a public parking lot. But the purse changed the texture of everything. A woman who voluntarily abandons her life does not leave her purse behind. A woman trying to disappear, to start over, to escape a bad marriage on her own terms. She takes her identification and her money. She takes the basic instruments of survival. The purse sitting in that unlocked car was not the detail of a woman who had chosen to vanish. It was the detail of a woman who had been taken. Investigators canvassed the Buttrey Food and Drug parking lot and the surrounding area. They spoke to employees, to customers who had been there that morning, to anyone who might have seen Lynn arrive, might have noticed something unusual in the lot, might have seen her speak to someone or get into another vehicle. The canvass produced nothing definitive. Nobody remembered seeing Lynn Bush that morning. Nobody remembered anything that could be turned into a lead. The search expanded outward from Casper in the days that followed. Volunteers joined law enforcement in combing the terrain surrounding the city, the high plains stretching out toward Casper Mountain, the banks and surrounding brush along the North Platte River, the empty acres of land that begin almost immediately where Casper's streets end. Search dogs were brought in. They worked the area around the Buttrey parking lot, trying to establish a scent trail that might indicate which direction Lynn had gone after her car was left. The dogs found nothing leaving the vehicle. No trail leading away from the Citation across the parking lot. No direction of travel. No indication that Lynn had walked anywhere from that car under her own power. That absence, the dogs finding no trail away from the vehicle, was significant in ways investigators understood even then. It suggested that Lynn had not walked away from that parking lot. It suggested that if she had left that location at all, she had left in a vehicle. Someone else's vehicle. The search of the surrounding landscape produced nothing. No clothing, no personal effects, no remains. The North Platte River, which cuts through the region and which has historically served as the kind of landmark that investigators check in cases involving missing persons, yielded nothing connected to Lynn. Casper Mountain, the elevated terrain visible from much of the city, was searched without result. The high plains extending in every other direction were too vast to comprehensively cover, a fact that anyone familiar with central Wyoming understands immediately, and that would become more relevant as the years passed, and the theory of where Lynn might be narrowed, slowly, toward the man who had last seen her alive. David Bush, throughout the search, maintained the posture of a concerned husband. He cooperated. He answered questions. He did not, notably, search for his wife with the kind of frantic energy that tends to characterize people who are genuinely terrified about what might have happened to someone they love. He was present. He was cooperative. And within days of her disappearance, Sherry Latimer moved into the house. Her name was Sherry Latimer. She was the woman David had clearly been involved with before Lynn disappeared, a relationship that the speed of her arrival made obvious to anyone paying attention. She didn't arrive gradually, easing into a situation that was still officially a missing persons case. She moved in. Her belongings came with her. She occupied the home, shared David's daily life, became a fixture in the house where Lynn had been living just days before. The people in Lynn's circle, her friends, the neighbors who had watched her marriage from the outside, the people she had confided in about wanting to leave, watched Sherry Latimer settle into Lynn's home and understood what it meant. They talked about it. They expressed their suspicions to whoever would listen. But expressing suspicion and giving investigators something prosecutable are entirely different problems, and in 1990, without a body and without forensic evidence that could be directly connected to David, Casper police could not move against him. Lynn's case was classified as a missing persons investigation. The active search wound down. The file was opened and, for practical purposes, left on a shelf. Then David Bush did something in 1991 that told the story more clearly than anything else he could have done. 1 year after Lynn vanished, 12 months after her purse had been found sitting in an unlocked car in a grocery store parking lot, 12 months after search dogs had found no trail leading away from that vehicle, 12 months during which there had been no contact from Lynn with any family member, friend, or acquaintance, David Bush went to court to have his wife legally declared dead. He wanted to collect her life insurance. The standard legal process for declaring a missing person dead requires years of absence. 7 years is a common threshold in many jurisdictions. The reasoning behind that timeline is straightforward. It provides a meaningful period during which a person might reasonably be expected to make contact if they were alive, and it prevents premature legal declarations that could disadvantage someone who has simply disappeared voluntarily and might return. 12 months is not 7 years. 12 months is barely past the point where investigators are still making regular checks, still hoping for a phone call, still holding the case inactive rather than cold status. David's attempt to accelerate that legal process generated immediate and fierce opposition. Lynn's family members appeared in court to fight the petition. They argued the obvious, that 12 months was nowhere near sufficient time to declare a woman dead, that Lynn had a daughter and family who needed more than a year of absence before the law would treat her as gone permanently, that granting David's petition would reward a man whose behavior since her disappearance had raised serious questions. The life insurance company's legal representatives pushed back as well. Insurance companies are not in the business of paying out policies on timelines that benefit policyholders who cannot account for a spouse's whereabouts. The circumstances of Lynn's disappearance, the abandoned car, the purse left behind, the absence of any contact with family, were precisely the kind of circumstances that made a rapid legal declaration of death look less like grief and more like financial strategy. The court denied David's petition. He did not get the life insurance payout. But the attempt itself became part of the institutional memory of Lynn's case, a data point that investigators who looked at the file over the years noted and understood. A man who kills his wife and then attempts to profit financially from her disappearance within 12 months is not performing the behavior of innocence. The petition was its own kind of evidence, even if it couldn't be used in a criminal prosecution at the time. David went back to his life. He had Sherry. He had the house. He had the truck. the family vehicle that had been present during the period of Lynn's disappearance and that was sitting in his driveway, carrying inside its toolbox something David apparently believed would remain hidden permanently. At some point in the years that followed, David sold the truck. It was an ordinary transaction on the surface. People sell vehicles. They upgrade. They need money. They move on from old cars for any number of reasons. But the truck's departure from David's possession was also the departure of physical evidence from his direct control. Evidence he may or may not have known was there. Evidence he may have believed he had successfully cleaned away. Evidence that was in fact still present in the seams and corners of a metal toolbox, waiting. When cold case investigators reopened Lynn's file in the early 2000s and began approaching it with the forensic tools and fresh perspective that had developed over the intervening decade, the truck became a priority. They needed to find it. Finding a vehicle sold years earlier requires working backwards through chains of ownership that don't always leave clean records. Wyoming Department of Transportation title transfer documents became the roadmap. Investigators traced the truck forward from David's original ownership through every subsequent buyer, every title transfer, every change of hands that had occurred since he sold it. Each transfer had to be documented and followed. Each subsequent owner had to be located, contacted, and interviewed to establish whether they had modified the vehicle, whether they had done any work on the toolbox specifically, whether anything about the truck's interior had been altered in ways that might affect what forensic processing would find. The interviews with subsequent owners established something important. The toolbox had not been significantly modified or replaced since David had owned the vehicle. Whatever was in it when he sold, it was still in it when investigators tracked the truck down and had it towed to a secure forensic processing facility in Wyoming. Inside that facility, under high-intensity forensic lighting, analysts went to work on the toolbox with the kind of methodical attention that cold case forensics requires. They weren't looking for visible blood. Visible blood would have been cleaned away years ago, or would have been noticed and mentioned by subsequent owners. They were looking for what visible cleaning can't reach. The seams where metal panels meet. The channel around the lock mechanism. The corners where the bottom of the toolbox meets its walls, where fluid can pool and dry and become part of the metal's surface chemistry. Forensic analysts used advanced chemical processes, including specialized luminol application and alternate light sources, to locate biological material that had been present in those spaces for years, material that had survived time and use and the ordinary accumulation of a working truck's life. They found blood in the seams of the toolbox, hidden but present, preserved by the metal around it in a way that surface cleaning cannot address. DNA testing confirmed it was Lynn's. The retrieval of this genetic material relied on polymerase chain reaction technology, a method of molecular biology that allows analysts to amplify a single or a few copies of a piece of DNA across several orders of magnitude. This technology, entirely unavailable to local police departments in 1990, allowed technicians in the early 2000s to generate a definitive genetic profile from a microscopic, degraded sample trapped inside a rusted sheet metal seam. The resulting profile left no room for statistical variance. The probability of the blood belonging to any individual other than Lynn Bush was calculated at 1 in many billions. But the toolbox was not the only piece of physical evidence that emerged from the reinvestigation. Investigators also examined a ring belonging to David Bush, an ordinary piece of jewelry, something worn daily, something present on his hand during the period surrounding Lynn's disappearance. The ring's setting, the detailed metalwork that holds a stone in place and that accumulates trace material from everything a hand touches, contained hidden deposits of blood deep within the microscopic crevices beneath the mount. The DNA profile extracted from the ring matched Lynn's as well. Lynn's blood in the seams of a truck toolbox David had sold years earlier, hoping it would disappear from the record. Lynn's blood in the setting of a ring David had worn on his hand. These were two completely distinct, unassailable physical anchors. They provided an immutable physical reality to a case that had existed purely as rumor, suspicion, and institutional frustration for nearly 2 decades. They formed a permanent bridge over the 17-year gap. The prosecution that went to trial in 2007 was built on this foundation. Prosecutors from the Natrona County District Attorney's Office presented a specific, detailed, and devastating theory to the 12 members of the jury. They argued that David Bush had not been surprised by his wife's disappearance because he had orchestrated it completely within the walls of their home. According to the state's reconstruction, David had killed Lynn in the bathroom of their Casper home. He had wrapped her body, loaded her into the bed of his truck, and driven out under the cover of darkness. He used his intimate knowledge of the massive, unpeopled Wyoming landscape surrounding the city to conceal her remains in an isolated location he has never disclosed to this day. The abandoned Chevrolet Citation at the Buttrey Food and Drug parking lot had been a deliberate stage piece. Lynn had never driven herself to that grocery store that Tuesday morning. The car had been placed there after the homicide, with her purse and keys left inside to construct a specific narrative, either a voluntary flight by a frustrated wife or a sudden random abduction by an unknown predator in a public lot. It was a cover story designed to build an immediate window of ambiguity, stalling police response during the critical first hours while he cleaned the residence. The defense countered with the traditional tools available in a no-body murder trial. They chose to aggressively target the testimony of the state's most critical witness, Misty Bush. When the defense team stood before the jury, they focused entirely on memory contamination and the known boundaries of developmental psychology. They told the jury that a 4-year-old child's recollection, held silently and unexamined for 17 long years, is inherently unstable. They argued that Misty's mind had been subjected to nearly 2 decades of external influence, that she had grown up surrounded by relatives who deeply suspected David, that she had lived through years of neighborhood conversation, and that she had overheard endless adult discussions regarding what might have occurred in that house. The defense argued that memory is not an archival recording that replays with absolute clarity. It is a highly malleable, reconstructive process. Every time a person recalls an event, the brain introduces new information, reshaping the original memory. They claimed Misty's recollection had been systematically, if unintentionally, reshaped by the environment around her over 17 years. They gestured constantly toward the fundamental void at the center of the courtroom: no body. Without a medical examiner's autopsy, without a confirmed crime scene, and without a definitive cause of death, they argued the state was asking 12 citizens to take a man's liberty based on the shifting psychological shadows of a traumatic childhood memory and trace blood samples that could have resulted from ordinary domestic cross-contamination. But the prosecution's case possessed an internal structural integrity that those arguments could not break down. The state answered the memory contamination theory by locking it directly to the hard physical science of the DNA profiles. Misty's memory did not stand alone. It aligned precisely with the physical locations where Lynn's blood had been recovered by modern forensic technology. If Misty's account had been a childhood fiction shaped by years of family suspicion, it could not have predicted the presence of her mother's blood inside the hidden seams of a utility box on a truck that had been sold away from the family years earlier. It could not explain why her mother's blood was caught inside the setting of her father's personal ring. The defense could challenge the human mind, but it could not cross-examine DNA. It could not explain away the blood in those hidden metal seams without conceding the core truth of the state's timeline. The physical evidence and the witness testimony formed a triangle that the defense could not collapse. When Misty Bush walked into that Casper courtroom in 2007, she was no longer the silent 4-year-old girl who had been forced to grow up under the roof of her mother's killer. She was an adult woman standing before the legal system of Wyoming, demanding an accounting for a crime that had been buried in institutional silence for 17 years. She took the stand, looked across the room at David Bush, and placed the exact sensory details of her childhood trauma into the permanent court record. She described walking into the family bathroom on that Tuesday morning. She described seeing her mother slumped over the edge of the bathtub. She described the blood on her mother's face, and she described her father standing directly over the body in the quiet house. She held her ground through hours of grueling cross-examination. She did not waver when defense attorneys tried to paint her as a confused child whose memories had been compromised by time and family bias. She remained completely steady, repeating her truth with a quiet, devastating clarity that resonated within the jury box. The 12 citizens of the jury did not see a contaminated or manipulated witness. They saw a daughter who had spent her entire life waiting for the moment she could finally speak for the woman who had been silenced. The jury deliberated and returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder in the second degree. 17 years after Lynn Bush disappeared from her life, the legal system finally caught up with David Bush. David was sentenced to a substantial term of imprisonment within the Wyoming State Correctional System. Justice, in its cold, institutional form, had finally been served. Yet as the prison doors closed behind him, the ultimate question remained completely untouched. David Bush went to his cell and maintained his absolute silence. He did not confess. He did not seek closure with his daughter. He refused to provide the single piece of information that mattered most to the family left behind. He has never said where Lynn is. Outside the city limits of Casper, the high plains of Wyoming roll out for uninterrupted miles in every single direction. It is a severe, beautiful, and profoundly lonely landscape. Thousands upon thousands of acres of sagebrush, dry earth, and deep sandstone ravines where a secret can remain buried for generations without ever being disturbed by human activity. The sheer physical geography of the state is not an incidental backdrop to this tragedy. It was David Bush's primary asset. In the late summer of 1990, the world was structurally different than it is today. There were no GPS trackers in consumer vehicles, no widespread network of highway surveillance cameras recording license plates at every junction, and no cellular tower triangulation systems capable of tracking the midnight movements of a family truck. A person with a reliable vehicle, a few hours of darkness, and an intimate familiarity with the unmapped dirt roads cutting through the sagebrush of central Wyoming could disappear into that horizon with near-total confidence. A body placed in that terrain could remain unrecovered indefinitely, protected by the sheer scale of the empty land. Lynn remains somewhere out in that silence. Or perhaps she doesn't, because no investigator has ever been able to definitively establish that David kept her remains within Wyoming's borders. The exact direction he drove that night, the total distance his truck covered before dawn, the methods he used, none of these details have ever been established by a court of law. The state knows only that she was violently taken, that her blood was left behind in the metal seams of his equipment, and that wherever her physical form rests today, the earth has refused to yield her back to her daughter. David Bush remains the sole living person who carries the answer to that question. He has guarded that secret through his arrest, through the pressure of his trial, through his conviction, and through every year of his incarceration since 2007. He treats that knowledge as a final piece of leverage, a private possession he refuses to surrender to the state that convicted him or to the daughter who exposed him. Whether advanced age, illness, or a late psychological shift will eventually force that truth into the light remains unknown. What the family understands with certainty is that the window will not remain open forever. At some point, the natural timeline of human mortality will close it. Whatever David Bush knows about that Tuesday morning will die with him, passing silently into the ground. When that day arrives, the land will claim its secret permanently, and Misty Bush will be left having done everything right. Kept the memory alive when the system tried to forget it, stood in a courtroom and stared down her mother's killer, watched the hand of legal justice remove him from the world, yet still unable to bring her mother home, to lay her to rest with dignity, to close the loop of an agonizing childhood nightmare. That is the profound, heartbreaking space this case occupies today. Not between guilt and innocence. That was settled permanently by a Wyoming jury in 2007. It exists instead in the painful divide between a legal verdict and a physical grave, between institutional justice and the deeply personal justice that actually carries meaning for a daughter who has navigated her entire adult life around a profound, unmapped absence. Those two things are fundamentally distinct, and no amount of prison years or judicial paperwork bridges the chasm between them. A conviction cleans the public ledger for the state. It does not fill the empty chair at a daughter's table, nor does it provide a place of remembrance where a family can gather to grieve. Lynn Bush deserved to live far past that Tuesday morning in 1990. She deserved to watch her daughter grow up. She deserved the entirely new, safe life she had been quietly planning during those anxious weeks when she was confiding her fears to the people she trusted most. She was actively looking for a way out of a deteriorating, dangerous situation, and she ran out of time before she could act. She left to run a routine errand on an unremarkable morning and was violently erased before she could reach her destination. Because of that theft, her 4-year-old daughter was condemned to spend the next 17 years of her life growing up under the same roof as the man who had taken her mother away, walking past the same bathroom, sitting at the same kitchen table, performing the daily rituals of a normal childhood, while carrying an image she couldn't share with the world until she was old enough to be heard. To this day, long after the trial concluded and the headlines faded, the Charlie Project maintains a permanent file for Lynn Lynette Bush. She remains classified as a missing person, not because law enforcement failed to identify her killer, not because the state failed to secure a conviction, but because she has never been physically recovered from the landscape. Her family cannot hold a proper funeral. Misty cannot stand at a headstone and say a final, peaceful goodbye. The most fundamental human resolution, the simple return of a person to the people who loved her, remains suspended with no guarantee that it will ever occur. Some convicted killers eventually experience a shift during their final years in prison, disclosing the locations of their hidden victims as a last act of remorse. Others carry that knowledge directly into their own graves, maintaining control over the narrative until their final breath. The legal system loses all its leverage after the sentence is handed down. It cannot force a man's mouth to open. The resolution of this long agony lives entirely inside the mind of a man sitting in a Wyoming cell who has looked at his daughter's grief year after year and chosen, with absolute calculation, to remain silent. Lynn Lynette Bush was a vibrant woman in her early 30s building a life in Casper, Wyoming. She was a mother who loved her daughter with fierce devotion, and she was a human being bravely attempting to reconstruct her reality on her own terms. She left her home to complete a simple errand on a Tuesday morning in 1990 and was killed before she could ever cross the threshold of the store. Her blood was recovered decades later from the dark seams of a truck toolbox. Her blood was found caught inside the metalwork of her husband's personal ring. Her daughter survived the long silence of a traumatic childhood to stand in a court of law and deliver the truth about what she had witnessed in that family bathroom when she was only 4 years old. Her killer was convicted 17 years later and continues to withhold the location of her remains. She has not been found. If you possess any information regarding the disappearance of Lynn Bush, if you have any knowledge of where David Bush may have driven his truck in the late summer of 1990, if you overheard him or Sherry Latimer mention any specific location in the weeks following her disappearance, or if you know anything at all that could assist the search, the Cold Case Unit of the Casper Police Department needs that information brought forward. A formal verdict was reached in 2007. Lynn has never been brought home. Those are two entirely separate realities, and only one of them has been resolved. She left for the grocery store on a Tuesday morning in 1990. She deserves to be found.